Today, we shall look at two cultures for one reason: to find threads within their culture that make them similar to other cultures. Now, why would we do this? Well, if looking at one culture could help you completely understand that culture, that would be fine. But there's something called cultural diffusion. In other words, certain cultures picked up or had a core culture, an underlying culture, which they inherited from maybe thousands or hundreds of years ago, and they still utilize within their cultures, no matter how different that culture was. In the Americas, from the north in Canada all the way down to the south in Peru, they had one thing in common, which I will talk about soon. And in Africa, I can see several things that they had in common. But again, one major thing they had in common. So let's get into it. But first, we leave Africa and the Americas and look at Europe and their core culture that might have stemmed from Africa.
Barring a handful of outliers, there are only 32 geometric signs. Only 32 signs across a 30,000-year time span and the entire continent of Europe. That is a very small number. Now, if these were random doodles or decorations, we would expect to see a lot more variation. But instead, what we find are the same signs repeating across both space and time.
Now, I want you to pay attention to her methodology, because these symbols, these 33 or 32 symbols, they repeat over and over again within the entire continent of Europe. She has no choice but to speculate that they represent a symbology that was inherited throughout the continent 30,000 years ago. And she continues.
Here with these divided rectangles that are only found in northern Spain, and which some researchers have speculated could be some sort of family or clan signs. On a side note, there is a surprising degree of similarity in the earliest rock art found all the way from France and Spain to Indonesia and Australia. With many of the same signs appearing in such far-flung places, especially in that 30,000 to 40,000 year range, it's starting to seem increasingly likely that this invention actually traces back to a common point of origin in Africa. But that, I'm afraid, is a subject for a future talk. So back to the matter at hand.
Now, I hope you understand, based on that, what a thread culture or a core culture passed down for thousands of years is. Like she said, these symbols are found as far away as Indonesia and Australia, these that are found in Europe as well. And they say that this might be because these patterns are found in Africa first, and then they come out from Africa into all of these other places. Now, time for the core cultures within Africa and then within the Americas. Or let's go the other way around. I once mentioned in a video that crosses in Africa were found all over the place, and that had to do with how they interpreted the skies. Now, at the time, I was not aware of how much evidence there was of this, because I had only read a few books on it that mentioned the Swahili and other Bantu tribes that did this. And of course, the Berbers had the same symbology, especially when it came to crosses and mixing two symbols together, or three or four, to create different types of crosses resembling things in their culture based on cosmology. But here we have it laid bare. It writes, pre-Christian crosses of Congo cosmology depicted in rock paintings, textiles, and pottery engravings drawn by Cecile Fremont. They were also used by the traditionalist Congo religion of Kimpasi, which existed parallel to Congo's church and some of whose practitioners were powerful courtiers. Now remember, I linked these crosses to the Berbers, the Egyptians, West Africans, East Africans, and Southern Africans. The only people that I think didn't utilize crosses quite so vastly were the Khoi. But not only were these crosses used, but they also used certain other core materials, like this video shows.
Ancient Egyptian kings were buried with this crossing of the hands. And as you can see, on one hand, he bears a crook. Maybe we should look at some alternatives. For example, the thing with a whip could be a typical African fan, which is now, because they're using jewelry, it looks a bit different than what a typical African fan would look like, but you'll see what I mean. And that crook could be a symbol of a weapon, a small weapon, like a mace or something like that. The crossing of the hands could merely be symbolism. For example, this crossing reminds me of symbols of a crucifix. Now, I hate to be obvious, but I have to. This crossing of the arms is obviously a defensive position rather than attack position, as you would see them holding a mace to the head of an enemy. This defensive position, which is an X, resembles something that I've said before. It's a shield. It resembles the shape of a shield. And like I showed you, in North Africa, the Berbers, an X or a cross, which is sideways, resembles a shield. A cross in South Africa also resembles a shield. In West Africa, it resembles a shield. So this cross symbol, even in Egypt, resembles a shield. You'll notice that the men cross their arms, even without the whisk and the crook. So in case you thought it had something to do with the whisk and the crook only, they do it with holding the other crosses, or they do it with just their hands, basically crossing their arms. This highlights that this is truly a symbolic thing and not an accident.
And now to move on to America before we go back to Africa. Confederacies existed all over the world, but the types of confederacies that existed in America fit the modern definition of a confederacy. Before, a lot of confederacies, especially those outside of the Americas, the Native American confederacies, were more alliances of convenience and tended to have leaders who are centralized in a location, whereas a lot of the ones in America were decentralized. An example of this, of course, is the Iroquois, who had multiple kings who shared about equal power. And because of this, they developed a form of democracy. They are not the only to do this, but they were one. We think that this is the biggest, but of course, we have the Blackfoot Confederacy that had 5 kings or 5 chiefs, but it's really 5 kings in one castle. After the Iroquois, who were starting to split up slowly, were defeated by the United States because they chose to back both the United States and the previous European empire at the same time. But what they didn't realize is that whoever won, racism would be put upon them. So they developed a United Indian Confederacy, a confederacy of confederacies. This means they had confederacies under their confederacies. Inside this confederacy were many confederacies, like the Iroquois or the Illinois Confederacy, groups like Miami, the Miami tribe, the Ojibwe, the Illinois, the Shawnee, the Wabash, Miami tribe, Potawatomi tribe, Odawa tribe, Lenape, Delaware tribe. And soon and later there would be other tribes that tried to join. They fought against the Westerners because they believed that the Westerners now were just trying to destroy their territories. These are only the North American ones, and they're not limited to these ones only. There were still further confederacies, and these confederacies seem to be the default. Unlike other places in history where they tended to be of convenience. So I'll give an example. Ancient Egypt is not a confederacy. The Zulu kingdom is not a confederacy. they're all empires. The Ethiopia is not a confederacy. Most places in the world are not confederacies. Now, there's some exceptions because there's confederate city states in Europe. For example, the Greeks created these city states. The Romans, some Celtics did this as well. So there are other people, but there's also something about the culture of Europe where there's a lot of democracies forming. But more about this confederacy, because as you know, the Iroquois are part of this confederacy or became part of this confederacy. The Iroquois used to be their own confederacy called the Six Nations. Well, these Six Nations joined this confederacy. And then there was the members of the Seven Nations of Canada, the Algonquin, Nipissing, Abenaki, and Wendat. Then there was the Illinois Confederacy with the Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Peoria, and others. Then there was the Mingo Confederacy of Trans-Appalachian, Cayuga, and Seneca splinter groups. Then there was the Menominee Confederacy. This was its own thing. Then there was the Kickapoo Confederacy. The Confederacy was periodically supported by communities and warriors from west of the Mississippi River and south of Ohio River, including Dakota, Chickamauga, Cherokee, and Upper Creek. As it was the culture of the Native Americans to try and form alliances instead of fighting wars, they also tried this with the Europeans, even after they had betrayed them. But others rebelled and didn't want to do it at all. We also have the Powhatan Confederacy that started in the late 1600s, but moving down south, we look at some of the biggest nations in history, like the Maya, who basically ruled this region and created a great civilization. But something people don't realize about it is that the Maya civilization was a confederacy in the beginning, created by three major groups: the Itza, the Tutal Shia, and the Kokom. These came together to create the Mayapan Confederation, with one of the biggest being Chichen Itza. Other Mayan speaking areas also had confederations, as it was part of their culture. Something called a Kuch Cabal, this is the literal translation, was a system of social and political organization common to the Maya polities of the Yucatan Peninsula in the Maya lowlands. During the Mesoamerican post-classical, there were somewhere between 16 and 24 such provinces just prior to the Spanish conquest of Yucatan. Many of the provinces were organized as unilaterally states governed by a single Halak Winnik governor. However, some were rather organized as confederacy of Bata Boilup towns, more or less closely knit and governed jointly or severally by the respective Bata Boab mayors, and further still, some seem to have been merely collections of towns in a given area, whose relation with one another are largely a matter of conjecture. This broadly provinces were organized either as unitary or federal states, with varying degrees of cohesion. The Aztec as well were a confederacy of states that joined together voluntarily to create a much more powerful state. This is to show that there's some kind of underlying culture here. Again, Blackfoot Confederacy is all the way in Canada, and then all the way down here, down south of North America, we have this Aztec, which is also a confederacy. Mesoamerica from the 14th to the 16th centuries, Aztec culture was organized into city-states, some of which joined to form alliances, political confederations or empires. The Aztec empires was a confederation of 3 city-states established in 1427. The capital city of the Mexico, or the Tenochca, the Texcoco, and Tlacopan, previously part of the Tupinic Empire, whose dominant power was Azcapotzalco. Now, were there any exceptions? Yes, there were actually quite a number of exceptions. The biggest one being the Incan civilization. That is one of the biggest empires, probably the biggest empire in America. This was not a confederation in any way that resembles the others in America. This was an absolute monarchy, an empire in the true sense. In one time, they had a diarchy, meaning that they had co rulership between two people, but that's about as democratic as they got. There are a lot of superficial things that you can point out about these people that would join them together, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper. I mean, you could point out how some of their historical houses seem to be this teepee shape, which, by the way, doesn't have to be that. As you can see in Africa, they could have built teepees, but instead they built that dome shape. And in the tattoos that they have a lot of similarities, and these clothes that they wear have similarities all the way from Canada down to the Incas. But these core cultures would split off in their own direction and come up with completely unique ideas.